Good morning, Hope Church. I stand here in a sanctuary where I have preached before, and it is just a little different than when I've preached on the other occasions. I was having breakfast with a good friend of mine, Travis West, this morning, and he was asking me, he said, well, won't it be very different preaching in that sanctuary? And I said, yes, it will be different because there won't be any people there. But to be honest, I'm pretty sure it will be just as quiet as it normally is. But I'm so grateful to be here. I'm grateful for my sister Jill and for Gordon in his absence and my sister Beth who have invited me into this pulpit and to share with you today. The text that I will be preaching from is actually the text that was read earlier by Pastor Jill. I would like to lift up a small part of that text to focus our time and our energy for this sermon this morning. From Genesis, hear these words, "But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, 'Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit with my son Isaac.' This matter was distressing for Abraham on account of his son, but God said to Abraham, 'Do not be distressed of this boy because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says do. For it is through Isaac that I will bring up offspring named for you. And as for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring.'" For the time that I have this morning, I would like to focus on the subject, why Hagar's son matters. Pray with me. Gracious and eternal God, I thank you that you have answered my prayers and become my salvation. Indeed, you are the salvation of the world. I'm grateful that you have allowed me this moment to speak a word to your people. I pray that it will be a word of hope, a word of love, a word of liberation, a word of righteousness for your name's sake. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Why Hagar's son matters. This text is from the lectionary, and as I typically do when I preach on any given Sunday, I like to follow the lectionary. And many times we find that the lectionary has a very powerful word to speak to us on that day and at that time. This is no different. The text from Genesis that we have before us is part of the overall narrative of Abraham and Abraham's many descendants. Sarah had not given birth at one time and was getting much older, but the promise that God had given to Abraham was still there. So we know about Hagar because she figures prominently in this story. Even though Sarah was not able to give birth, she found her Egyptian slave girl, the one who belonged to Sarah, and Sarah decided to give her slave girl to Abraham to bear children for him. Now, there is no indication in the text that this slave girl had any say in the matter. There is no indication that Sally Hemings actually There is no indication that Hagar actually consented. But the story is told that she was impregnated by Thomas Jefferson. The story is told that Hagar was impregnated by Abraham. But Sarah was not happy about this and mistreated Hagar thereafter, which brings us to the particular text we have today. After Hagar's son Ishmael had grown up to be about 15 or so, Sarah did indeed give birth to Isaac. And that's when the real trouble begins. Sarah was not happy to have Ishmael in the same house as her son Isaac. This descendant of a slave really should not be there, and You can almost sense the hysteria in Sarah's voice as she demanded that this boy leave her sight. She demanded that this boy not be around her anymore. It's almost as if you get an image of Sarah grabbing her cell phone, calling the police to report an African Egyptian who is threatening her. Get them out of my presence. Let them become another statistic in the churning grinder of the prison industrial complex. Let them become another castaway in the time of mass incarceration. I'm sorry, I'm just preaching the lectionary. Ishmael was not wanted in this narrative. Abraham and Sarah presumably disagree over the fate of Hagar and Ishmael, but ultimately, Sarah's wishes prevail, and God says to Abraham that it will be okay. He wants Abraham to focus on other things at the moment. God is not going to forget about Ishmael, though, because Hagar's son matters to God. God protects them. God looks after them. And we go on celebrating Abraham because Abraham's descendants, all of Abraham's descendants, matter. But do they? This weekend, on Friday, we celebrated Juneteenth. Juneteenth is largely an African-American holiday commemorating slavery and celebrating the freedom that came with emancipation. Slavery in this country lasted 246 years. It was an unimaginable horror. Millions died in the Middle Passage. Those who survived, for them, the worst was yet to come. They were subjected to torturous labor. They were born and bred into slavery for generations. Enter the Civil War. You know that story about brother against brother, North against South. It was really about slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln didn't abolish slavery, it just brought freedom to those slaves who were part of the Confederate States. It wasn't until the 13th Amendment that slavery was actually abolished. So what happens after the end of the Civil War? Well, they began creating a holiday, and they called that holiday Memorial Day. And in the South, it was to commemorate the soldiers who died fighting on behalf of the South. In the North, it was supposed to commemorate the soldiers who died fighting on the side of the North. But there was no commemoration for slavery. There was no celebration of their freedom. What did slaves and the descendants of slaves get? They got another 100 years of Jim Crow segregation and lynching. Reconstruction did nothing to improve the lives of former slaves. There was never any reparations that addressed the impact of slavery on enslaved persons and their descendants. It's as if enslaved persons and the descendants of enslaved persons don't really matter to this country. But the Confederate flag matters, right? Monuments to men who fought to keep people enslaved matter. But the enslaved persons and their descendants were not really allowed to say that they matter. Juneteenth says something different. Juneteenth commemorates the history of slavery, and it's celebrated by African Americans all over this country. It marks the day, June 19th in 1965, when news of emancipation finally reached Galveston, Texas. It celebrates the freedom that was experienced at the end of the Civil War. It provides a chance for African Americans to express their culture, their heritage. It is a way of emphatically saying that Black lives matter, even if the rest of society doesn't want to acknowledge it. We're seeing a change. People are beginning to talk about it more. People are beginning to think about how we might celebrate Juneteenth more widely. And even as the narrative is being rewritten, we actually have a chance to have it make an impact on the present and on the future. We have the ability to focus a little bit differently on creating a different narrative. Ishmael had a place in the narrative of Abraham, even though we as a church don't always recognize or talk about it. You see, Ishmael's story is obscured by the dominant all Abraham's descendants matter narrative that we tend to focus on for the church, when in reality, Ishmael is virtually ignored. We are reminded of Ishmael's existence when Abraham dies, but there's more to Ishmael's story than that. We need to recognize that the importance of understanding Ishmael's place in the narrative helps us to see more clearly God's example and how God really does care for particular people. God's provisions on this planet, God's provisions in this world are for all. God cares about all. But we also know that at specific times and in specific places, God cares about specific people and specific groups of people. God provides specifically for those who are in particular need of God's attention. We need to turn our attention to those in this country who continue to experience injustice and discrimination. Hagar's descendants matter. Black lives matter. When I was in seminary, one of my professors, my advisor actually, was Dr. Linda Thomas, who was part of the second generation of womanist theologians, and she taught me a lot about theology, and specifically she shared with me the importance of womanist theology. One of the forebearers of womanist theology, Dolores Williams, wrote a book called Sisters in the Wilderness, drawing on the biblical figure of Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, who was cast into the desert by Abraham and Sarah, but still protected by God. Williams finds a prototype for struggle for African American women in Hagar, in this African slave who was homeless and exiled, who was forced to be a surrogate mother. Hagar's story provides an image of survival and defiance that is appropriate for black women and black people today. Womanist theology can perhaps help us to see what our task is for today. Womanist theology is a prophetic voice concerned with the well-being of the entire African American community and attempts to cast a vision of freedom from oppression, because womanists oppose all forms of oppression: race, sex, class, sexual orientation, physical ability. They oppose all forms of oppression. Womanist theology emphatically insists that black lives matter. We need to learn from and lean into this idea of womanist theology, even as we think about our present moment and the future that God is calling us to create. If Ishmael mattered to God, then Ishmael should matter to us. God reassured and comforted Hagar. I think we have a lot of reassuring and a lot of comforting to do in this day and time. We have to assure black mothers and black fathers that their children matter. We have to comfort those who have lost children to violence and racism. We have to let them know that they matter and their children matter. We need to do more than just show them. We need to be able to demonstrate it concretely. Even as we seek to reassure and comfort, there's still more that we need to do. Maybe we need to do more than send an encouraging text message. Maybe we need to do more than just put a Black Lives Matter border around our Facebook page or put a sign in our yard. In addition to reassuring and comforting, we also need to do the work of justice that ensures on making Black lives matter. God built up Ishmael. God built up Ishmael's descendants into a nation just as God built up a nation through Isaac's part of the lineage. What that says to us is that we need to build up and strengthen those people who are descendants of slaves. We need to build up the African American communities, and it's everybody's responsibility. It's not too late for Reconstruction, and it's not too late for reparations. Instead of building more prisons, we need to build more schools. Instead of purchasing more tanks to roll through American streets, we need to beef up our public transportation system to increase access. Instead of tear gas, rubber bullets, and batons, Black bodies need better jobs, affordable housing, and universal health care. This is our task today. This is what we learn from Juneteenth. To paraphrase a song from the musical Hamilton, history has its eyes on us. So how do we know that Hagar's son matters? Well, the text goes out of its way to remind us that Hagar's son and Hagar's descendants matter. Because as my friend Travis West reminded me earlier, in chapter 25, when Abraham died, even though Ishmael had been excluded from the inheritance, even though Ishmael had been excluded from a major part of the narrative, Ishmael comes back to help his brother Isaac bury their father Abraham. The writers show us that Hagar's descendants matter by even giving us the names of the descendants through Ishmael. These are the descendants of Ishmael, the text says, Abraham's son, whom Hagar, the Egyptian, Sarah's slave girl, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, the named in the order of birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, Kedar, Abdel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names. We need to say their names. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Botham Jean, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, Jordan Davis, and many others. Let us remember to say their names. Amen.